Today, or tonight, we are going to talk particularly about the problem of insight, the problems that the concept of insight poses to therapists, particularly to psychoanalysts. And we will try and define it and look at the different types of insight and what the ideas are that have been moving around in the field of psychotherapy. That's who I am, so most of you know me. But that's for the international audience that, as you know, continues to be very, very large. We get about 80,000 people looking at these programs all over the world. This paper that I'm going to present you with is really an extensively revised and updated version. In fact, I have been working in it till today, of a paper that I wrote on these subjects many years ago, and of my remarks as the moderator of the Anna Freud Symposium on Insight, which took place in November of 1978 in Detroit, Michigan, under the auspices of the Michigan Psychoanalytic Society. Papers were contributed at that time by Anna Freud in absentia. In other words, she sent the paper to be read by Hamsey Kennedy, which was at the time the director of the Hamsey Clinic, There was Dr. Harold Bloom, Peter Neubauer, and Marianne Chris. My papers were sent by them. My contribution was read as well in Spanish sometime later in Monterrey, Mexico, on the occasion of the opening of the Institute of Mental Health, Instituto de Salud Mental, that took place in December of 1978. So that gives you the background. Interestingly enough, important as a subject of insight really is. Insight is not a subject that is much mentioned recently in the literature. Indeed, there have been an enormous paucity of papers in this most important subject since the 80s, but the reasons for this are not clear. Harold Bloom, in 1979, in an important paper on this subject, concluded that, quote, insight is a sine qua non of the psychoanalytic process and is a condition, catalyst, and consequence of the psychoanalytic process. Clinical psychoanalysis maximizes insight and minimizes other therapeutic influence. Now, if you go by that definition, clearly it's of extraordinary importance in psychoanalytic psychotherapy, and I believe in all forms of psychotherapy. I'm going to define insight later on to you. For the moment, we are going to leave it at the level that we more or less handle it, and that is a special perception, all of a sudden, of something that we had not realized before that is important. It's a kind of illumination that takes place in the course of the treatment of patients with a new understanding, a new comprehension of a problem that had not been seen before, and so on. It's the classical aha response of patients. Aha, now I understand. And we are going to leave it there for the moment, and then we will go into the more precise definition. Now, that view that I expressed by Bloom was shared by most analysts at that time. George Pollack, which was a very distinguished, recently deceased psychoanalyst from Chicago, had been a president of the American Psychoanalytic Association. In 1981, for example, stated, quote, insight articulates with all facets of psychoanalysis and has been of, how you say that word? Pivotal significance from the very beginning of our discipline. Anna Freud has written somewhat about insight. The first thing that she in 1978 is a paper that she sent to us in Detroit, to the Michigan Psychoanalytic Society, and then in 1979 and in 81 she had written about it some further. And she had wondered whether psychoanalysis has moved away from the original conviction that it is knowledge of the unknown inner life that cures. In other words, insight into your inner life. She further stated in 1980 that, quote, without wanting to devalue the importance of the transference, which is essential in this form of treatment, I think we have to keep in mind that it is the insight produced by the transference that is the central idea. Insight for the analyst and insight for the patient. She remarked as well on the fact of the increasing insight that is shown by analyzed children vis-a-vis non-analyzed children. They have a much better understanding of the inner world and the conflicts. And notice that she remarked that insight works both ways. Analysts and therapists have insight, and patients have insight. Peter Neubauer, in 1979, pointed out that no satisfactory psychoanalytic definition exists, having, quote, insight during psychoanalysis comprises the expansion of the ego by self-observation, memory recovery, cognitive participation, and reconstruction in the context of affective reliving. See, it's a very wide concept with a lot of implications. Tenser, in 1988, tried to relate the concept of insight to Piaget's conception. On the basis of Piaget's works on, quote, the grasp of consciousness, end of quote, she described 4 overlapping stages for insight, which are the following: unconscious behavior, working through self-observation, and conscious thought. It's a progression that goes from the unconscious behavior to the conscious thought. Wilson, in 1998, referred to some moments of insight where the patient experiences the emergence of something alien within the self, drive-related, affective, and at times uncanny in feeling. They, quote, are crucial yet neglected experiences of insight within the therapeutic process, end of quote, because, he believed, they do not fit with the traditional integrative views of insight, thus preventing, quote, our fully appreciating these experiences of insight in our patients, end of quote. This, as you see, is a different kind of insight, given the way that it appears and the way the uncanny characteristic that seem to have is a special type of situation that I described. Joyce and Stoker, in the year 2000, see insight not as a sudden illumination, as many people do, though obviously that's an oversimplification, but, and this is a quote, as usually a slow and gradual realization of something about oneself which unfolds in rather mundane, ordinary ways. It does not necessarily take place at a conscious level. It may be located in the preconscious, and indeed it frequently is. It may be accumulated over time and experienced as a sudden conscious flash, but that is not necessarily the case. But this is true. It accumulates in the preconscious, doesn't hit consciousness until one day it comes to you with a full realization, which obviously didn't take place just in that moment, had been elaborated in the preconscious mind for some while. Other, like object relationists, question whether it is insights or the relationship that are the relevant curative factor. Humberto, in 1992, thought that it was both, but that the effects of the two bear a unique relationship to each other. The problem, he thought, that had divided the exponents of these two viewpoints is the failure to realize that an understanding relationship cannot be maintained without insight into the dynamics of the relationship itself. So as you see, there is a very close relationship between these two points of view. Obviously, they cannot be isolated and say mine is better than yours, or, you know, wash is whiter than the other. Now, more recently, in the year 2000, Joyce and Stoker concluded, and this is interesting because it applies to children, that children 4 or 5 years old demonstrate in their own age appropriate way, differently from adults, that they have the capacity for insight. And as you will see in a moment, that's a view that runs contrary to those of Hans Kennedy, the director of the Hampton Clinic at that time, and Anna Foot, as we will show. It says here, we have seen, we haven't seen it yet. They restrict the term insight to mean knowledge gained by the analyst during psychoanalysis of his own inner life that had previously been inaccessible to him. Now, let's go to some general considerations, and let's start by looking at the definition of insight. And I will read you the definition from the Webster Dictionary, which goes as follows. And there is more than one definition. But one is the ability to see and understand clearly the inner nature of things, especially by intuition. 2, another definition, a clear understanding of the inner nature of some specific thing. 3, in psychology, awareness of one's own mental attitudes and behaviors. In psychiatry, the recognition of one's own mental disorders. The first 3 definitions, with slight modifications, are reasonably representative of the use of the term among psychoanalysts. Insight is frequently used as synonymous with understanding, with knowledge, be that of the descriptive or the acquaintance type, to use Bertrand Russell terms. Synonym of comprehension, of introspection, of a sudden realization, and so on. The value of insight in psychoanalysis have been very well established and have been discussed on occasion. Indeed, Richfield in 1954, for example, has said that the criterion of whether a given form of psychotherapy is analytic has been made to rest upon the undoing of neurotic defenses through the achievement of insight, especially through the insight gained by the interpretation of resistance and derivative impulses expressed by the patient in his transference. And there you see the reference to Anna Freud earlier quote, where she says that the insight gained in the transference is the trick. Okay. Now, the history of the term is interesting. It still remains a somewhat obscure subject, really, in terms of what happens. How do you get this sudden consciousness, conscious awareness, this sudden state of consciousness, of a special consciousness related to a particular situation, a particular feeling, a particular set of events, a particular situation in your life, and so on. The origin of the term itself is not very easy to trace. Further, through the years, it seems to have acquired a variety of different meanings. Sandler, for example, in 1973, believed that the term was borrowed from psychiatry. It is not without interest to point out the fact that the term does not appear listed in the General Index of the Standard Edition at all. That's remarkable. Bloom, in 1978, found the term in a passage of the interpretation of dreams, actually. So, though it is not in the index, it's somewhere in the text of the interpretation of dreams, which, as you know, is volume 4 and 5 of the Standard Edition. Personally, that is me, I know only of a handful of occasions in which the term appears in Freud's work. And so as you see, the history of the term is not very clear. Obviously, it has many meanings. There are many types of insights, and it plays a large number of roles in any psychotherapeutic process. Whether the person doing the psychotherapy acknowledges the concept of insight or not doesn't matter. It is taking place anyhow, whether the therapist knows it, accepts the concept, or doesn't. In any case, let's move on. Let's talk about the degrees of insight. And we will look at the varieties of insight and then look at the patient vis-a-vis therapist insight. Now, there are not only different degrees of insight, but there are many varieties of it as well. Thus, for example, we will hear and do hear of deep, emotional, experiential, psychological insight as a contrast to superficial, verbal, or intellectual insights. Richfield, in 1954, says about the latter, quote, if, for example, a person is aware that various psychological factors interfere with his social adjustments and the fulfillment of his capabilities, his recognition that he needs help in overcoming his adaptive limitation is considered to be a manifestation of insight. Such insight is helpful in diagnosis, classification, and prognosis, but it is considered to be of comparatively insignificant therapeutic importance. These insights are generally considered to be verbal or intellectual and to differ significantly from what has been termed genuine psychological insights. Psychological insights, though, are said to consist of some understanding or appreciation of the motives and genesis of the symptoms. But among this group of insights, important differences are to be noted. Of course, there is as well the question of patient's insight vis-a-vis the therapist's insights. In both cases, but particularly in the latter, the meaning is frequently that of understanding, but the word itself has some kind of mystical connotation as well. Now, so we have looked at intellectual insights. Let's talk a little more about this, the emotional insights and the dynamic insights. Reid and Finswiger in 1952 concluded that any, and this is a quote, any instant of insight necessarily entails some cognitive act by which the significance of a pattern of relations is grasped. Insight is said to be cognitive as distinguished from the cognitive or affective state which do not, as such, express inference, make claims as to trust or yield knowledge. End of quote. These same authors distinguish some three groups of insight: the intellectual insight, the emotional with a sub-variety, and the dynamic insight. They are defined as follows. The intellectual insight first. By intellectual insight is meant a cognition in which neither of the terms in the relation whose significance is grasped by the act of insight is an emotion. Since it is granted that any insight is by definition intellectual, this variety is called neutral. The insight is neutral with respect to emotion. The emotional insight. This is a quote from the description of emotional insight. This is said to be one in which some relevant emotion is a part of the subject matter grasped by the patient. This type is to be distinguished from the type of insight that makes the patient conscious of some fact which then cognitively mediates an emotion. In other words, an emotional response is released or set off by an insight which, unlike the first variety of emotional insights, need not itself be about an emotion. The dynamic insight. In their opinion, this is the summum bonum of the insights and the summum bonum of analysis. Quote, such insight is dynamic in the systematic Freudian sense of penetrating the repressive barrier and making the ego aware of certain hypercathectic wishes that were previously unconscious. End of quote. It is said of it that it leads to therapeutic changes. That's why it's called the summum bonum. Through the economic shift brought about with their consequent alterations in the unconscious cathexis on thought contents at various levels of organization in the symbolic behavior of the patient. So that's the dynamic insight. You see, there is quite a complexity of views of it. But it's really very interesting, and there are really these differences between them. And they have some clinical and prognosis significance, because as you will see in a moment, not uncommonly they may be used as a resistance. And it's very misleading, because this patient is very insightful, not so. It's using this as a kind of false insight, as you will see in a moment. In any case, there are as well those insights that are descriptive insights or ostensive insights, and the meanings of these terms are similar to those of Bertrand Russell, knowledge by description and knowledge by acquaintance. You know, many years ago, when he was alive in England, somebody approached him and asked him if he knew about cocaine, and how did he know about it. And he told these people that there were two ways of knowing about cocaine. But you read in a book about the effects of cocaine. And the other is if you have tried cocaine, then you know it from the gut. That's the acquaintance insight. In other words, the knowledge is from having experienced the phenomena, not from having read what the phenomena produces in people that uses the drug. Okay? So this descriptive and ostensive insights have somewhat related, they are somewhat related and are similar in some ways to this concept of Bertrand Russell. So instead of the above terms, though, Richfield in 1952 proposed descriptive insights and ostensive insight, that's instead of the ones we saw before, with meanings similar to Russell's knowledge, what I just mentioned to you a moment ago. Now, Meyerson introduced the concept of modes of insight, implying not only the type, which we have been describing, but the processes that lead to it. He proposed that there are analytic insights and reality-oriented insights. Okay, thus in 1965 referred to these two types of insight in a paper that he wrote at that particular point in time. One other important problem that is not well understood is the very significant differences in the therapeutic results of the various forms of insight. Not all forms of insight lead to improvement, lead to positive therapeutic results. Indeed, as I mentioned to you a moment ago, some of them are used defensively. And of course that doesn't lead to any improvement. It may lead to a deterioration of the patient or a maintenance of the problem as easily. Indeed, insights do not always lead to an improvement in the patient's condition, but a significant deterioration of it for that reason. The best example of this is obviously that of the negative therapeutic reactions, where the insight may be legitimate, but that gained knowledge of the patient, given the form of taken by the neurosis and the superego attitude to any improvement in the feelings of well-being that may be totally unacceptable, demands a price, which means the patient has to get worse, and it's called a negative therapeutic reaction. It's very surprising because you say, but we had gained a new understanding. The patient clearly had a significant form of insight. It didn't lead to an improvement, it led to the deterioration of the condition of the patient. It's not that the insight was not legitimate. It may have been quite legitimate, and it is precisely for that reason that the superego rages then against the ego, because it can tolerate the improvement given the nature of the conflict between the ego and the superego. In any case, I propose in this paper two other possible forms of insight, as if there were not enough already, that are in contrast to one another, and it is what I call genuine insights, meaning legitimate insights, true insights. Again, vis-a-vis what are really false insights, that is connections made by patients spontaneously or perhaps after an interpretation by the therapist with the clear intention of avoiding significant or genuine insights. In other words, the patient throws back to you an interpretation, his own interpretation of a certain event, which seems to imply that he has insight as to what are the rationale behind the behavior of the symptoms or whatever it is, but in fact that is just a smoke screen to hide the real rationale behind the problem. And that's a defensive type of insight, which of course doesn't lead to an improvement, and you have to watch for. There are some patients that are particularly good at this, because they are very psychologically minded and they can throw at you any number of interesting interpretations that they themselves give to you, let alone that there are some patients that have to compete with the therapist in terms of who is better at giving interpretations, the therapist or himself, and that of course will create problems that you need to be alert to in the treatment of this particular type of patient. Insights are generally assumed to lead to significant improvement in the patient's conditions. That's what they generally do. Insight, remember, was called the summum bonum of analysis and of the therapeutic procedure for that very reason. Indeed, they are extraordinarily important in the patient's understanding of his condition, the nature of the conflict, the nature of the production of the symptoms, and consequently of the resolution of the same. So insight and the negative therapeutic reaction we already have described, and that should give you some idea that there are not uncommonly some potential problems in this area that one needs to be alerted to. Now, we are going to discuss now a little bit that require ego functions that were very well described, best described by Ernst Chris as early as 1956, meaning 50 years ago, is the best description of the various functions that are required in order to produce insight. And this is really very interesting, and it will show reasonably well what skills and functions the ego must be able to exercise in order to produce insights. Chris, in this year, 56, describes the function of insight as the end product of a multiplicity of combined ego functions. And it's very complex, and it requires several ego functions in interaction to reach insight. He addressed the following as essential. One is an ego capacity for self-observation, particularly reflective or critical self-observation. To be reflective and critical. Just a capacity to self-observe is not good enough. We have to have this critical element to it, the reflective element. You have to observe, self-observe, and then, be reflective about what you observe. Two, an ego capacity to control the discharge of affects. Three, an ego capacity to tolerate unpleasant affects. Frequently insights get you into not very pleasant kind of situations in terms of the affect that accompanies the insight, for example, or the feelings that accompany it. Fourth, an ego capacity for control ego regression. Five, an ego capacity to utilize the synthetic and integrative capacity for the purposes of insight. These are two fundamental ego functions that must be brought to bear in the process of insight. In this same paper, Chris added that in terms of insight, there are enormous differences among individuals, which is obvious. Quote, it is as if in every case the function of insight was differently determined and its impact differently embedded in the balance of the personality, end of quote. But yes, that's a fact of the question of insight, that there are different individuals with different capacities for insight. There are some very gifted people that have a special ability to self-observe in a critical manner and can use all of these functions and put it together, and they are really very, very insightful. Now, we are going to take a look at the factors that may influence children's capacity for insight. Remember, this paper, which is looking at insight as a general phenomenon and the problems that it carries with itself, is going to do that on the basis of a comparison of children and adults. And you will find, I hope, as indeed I have, that comparison very enlightening. Now, let's look at the problems, the factors that may influence or indeed influence the children's capacity for insight. The child, this young child, indeed up to quite an age, we're talking up to well into latency, the child's inability to tolerate painful affects, as well as the automatic tendency to avoid painful affects. This is normal at that age. This includes two children in the latency period until quite up into the latency period. Another factor is a tendency to reverse affects, i.e. sadness to joy. Now, you reverse affects, obviously you are not going to be very insightful because you are distorting the nature of the experience. And so you are not going to be reflective. You'll be reflective of something that is already distorted because you have changed the affect for something that is, in fact, is reverse, sadness to joy, for example, which, as you know, happens, frequently and commonly in children, even in situations of extreme drama, like the death of the mother, that the child goes into the street laughing. My mommy died, ha ha ha. He's running all over the place and everybody's looking at him and say he fell from Mars. Because they see crazy, how can he be laughing about his mother's death? Well, he's not crazy, he didn't fall from Mars. Children of that age cannot tolerate that kind of pain and they reverse affects. That's the way they handle it. It's a primitive defense. If he was an adult and he did it consistently, you probably will think that he is psychotic. Now, there is a small child mental processes which, as you know, are governed by the pleasure principle, which is related to the two previous points. Because the small child emotional life and intellectual processes to a good degree are governed by the pleasure principle, then obviously these two other factors get reinforced by that general tendency. The change to the reality principle from the pleasure principle takes years in childhood. It's not done easily. It's done with enormous difficulty, and it takes a very large degree of cognitive development that takes many years to take place. And it remains for some time, once you have reached the ability to function according to the reality principle and not to the pleasure principle, it remains unstable for quite some time when in the presence of significant conflicts or anxiety. In other words, the child reverts from using the reality principle to going back to the pleasure principle for a while. Okay. Now, so you see these factors kind of reinforce each other somewhat. There are any number of other factors of this type that we are going to be referring to. And here are some more. That is a child's limited capacity for reality testing. Children cannot reality test the way you and I do. They don't distinguish inside from outside in the same way that we do. That is, in the sense of distinguishing his fantasies or fears or whatever from reality, as well as his limitation to assess and understand external reality. They have a limited cognitive capacity, limited experience, and they cannot understand external reality like adults do. So they tend to understand external reality on the basis of their experience and the level of cognitive development. Now, naturally, all this is very variable and depends on the age of the child, the intelligence of the child, the background, home background, parents of the child, and so on. It is usually not much of a problem as latency advances, because by then the child capacity for reality testing would have been improved very significantly. There is then the fifth point, which is the level of cognitive development at the various ages, that explains, among other things, the restricted capacity of the child to assess, understand, and process external reality, which we already mentioned. Okay? Then there is the specific characteristics of children's thought processes at certain ages. That's point 6. As you know, early on in life, and for quite a number of years, children think in concrete terms. They are not capable of thinking in abstract terms for some time. They are quite concrete in the thinking, let alone that there is a period in life that we will go through where the thinking is animistic and is based on magic and animism. Everything is animated and we understand the world as being animated. Chairs, tables, everything has an animal during a number of years in childhood. That's why I frequently give the example of a child that runs into a table, hits his head on the table and calls his mom and says, "Mommy, Mommy, the table hit me." You know, and he's trying to kick the table because he's attributing evolution to the table. In other words, the table has an animal, it's animated. And it takes some time for children to grow out of that stage. Then there is the tendency towards action of young children. Young children retranslate feelings, thoughts, wishes, longing, and so on into action very rapidly. And that action can be, again, quite specific and concrete. There is a children's limited ability to tolerate frustration. The younger he is, the less he can tolerate frustration. Obviously, there are enormous variations even in older children in terms of the ability to tolerate frustration. If they have certain disorders, like, ADHD, for example, they don't have much ability to tolerate frustration at all. They have little ability to postpone gratification. The younger they are, the less ability they have. Is similarly true in terms of accepting substitutes. They want what they want, not anything else, until later on in life. And of course they have limited capacity to sublimate early on in life. As they grow older, that capacity improves, and of course then these processes will be a little easier. Okay. Some more factors. These are all factors that influence the children's ability to produce insight, or to have insight, or have the capacity to produce insights. Children, particularly young children, have no sense of time or concepts as before, now, after, or yesterday, or tomorrow. That takes some time to be acquired. There are the limitations in the capacity to verbalize. There are the limited capacity for self-observation and self-criticism. There is the egocentrism of the child. They are very egocentric. For many, we all are. We never grow completely out of it, but as you grow older, you can put most of your egocentricity behind, and you don't any longer think that you are the center of the world, though somewhere in a corner of your mind you still think that frequently. There is an inability for controlled regressions. In other words, when child regresses, particularly a young one, he does regress. It's not a controlled regression. For young children, their impulses and wishes are non-conflictual. And that's a significant problem. They are developmentally legitimate, some of these impulses and some of these wishes. They go with the developmental stage. Thus, they look for gratification, not for attempt at understanding anything. They don't want to understand anything. They want to gratify their need. All of these are obviously factors that influence tremendously the ability of the child to produce insight. Let me move ahead a little bit. Here you have some other, which and this is an important one. Under the impact of the strong feeling, children cannot be reflective and at times need to be controlled, as you know. It's not like an adult that can tolerate an enormous amount of upsetting feelings at a certain point in time. Children can do that. The younger the child, the more difficult that is. Obviously, all of this interfere with your ability to be reflective in a rational manner and self-introspect, because you don't want to be there. You know? There is the use of defenses such as displacement, denial, and externalization, which are massive at this age in young children, and also the latency period and even the beginning of the adolescent stage. And all of these defenses obviously don't favor the production of insight. There is a belief of the young child in the omniscience and omnipotence of adults related to the belief in magic. Only that the magic now is not in itself, is attributed to the adults. There is a child's frequent lack of motivation for treatment. In other words, he's not bothered by his symptoms, so he has no reason to be reflective and try and understand why it is that he's doing what he's doing or behaving the way he's behaving or having the symptoms that he's having. The symptoms bother other people, don't bother him. If he wets the bed, that's not a problem for him, or if he wets himself. It's a problem for other people. And so he lacks motivation. And that's a common phenomenon with children, yeah? Now, let me move ahead. Now, clearly at different ages, the stage of development and degree of cognitive skill reached will determine how far insights are possible before adulthood in the under 5, particularly the latent child, and even in the adolescent. Obviously, as they grow older, the capacity for insight improves. The very young frequently looks for legitimate gratification of his needs, not for understanding, when in treatment. Indeed, he wants the therapist to gratify his needs. The latency and adolescents are more capable of insight, but many forces work against it, which obviously have to be taken into account by the therapist. Nearly all the factors mentioned for the child are applicable to the difficulties that many adults have to achieve insight. See, many of the things that we describe in children, where they are normal for the various stages of development, are things that adults have retained, either because they have fixation points in certain places, or we have retained as a defensive measure, as a way of adapting to our internal problems and conflicts and difficulties in development and so on. We have retained some more primitive forms of dealing with things or handling things and things of that kind. Thus, the careful study, I think, of the difficulties experienced by children will contribute to clarify many of the similar difficulties experienced by adults. And we are going to get into that exactly now. So, I say here in the paper, which will accompany this when it is published in the web page, the paper will go with it. Perhaps more important is to call your attention to the fact that all the variables mentioned for the child already, and you saw there were quite a number of them, where they are present for reasons of the stage of development, can be seen in isolation or in various combinations in our adult patients. This is due sometimes to a specific ego deficits acquired during development that could not be mastered, and at other times because some functions get caught in conflicting situations as you grow up, that if unresolved satisfactorily will seriously interfere with these functions in the adult ego, so you remain at the level of a child in that realm. It is these two sets of reasons that explain why many adult patients are as resistive to the acquisition of insights as are children, and in many cases for the very same reasons or very similar ones. It is my opinion, then, that the careful study of the various variables or factors in development that interfere with the acquisition of insight in children, which is normal for the stage, and will contribute to clarify many of the difficulties in this regard that we frequently observe in the adult patient. This distinction between the acquisition and the use of insight by the ego will be discussed somewhere else, because that's another issue. Here then, we can see another important contribution of child analysis to the analysis of adults. As Chris said, the complexity of ego functions which participate in the process of gaining and using insight may well account for the wide variations of the impact of insight on individual cases, as I mentioned to you a little earlier. Now, let me give you some specific examples. Let's make some clinical comparison between children and adults in terms of the capacity for insight and the factors that interfere with it. Leave it there. Here, in Mrs. Kennedy paper at the Detroit Science Symposium in 78 on insight, and by my own experience as an analyst for children and adults, have convinced me that the study of these difficulties that interfere with the acquisition of insight in children will lead us to find the prototypes of similar difficulties that are observed in our adult patients. Thus, for example, Kennedy, while discussing some children characteristics that of necessity interfere with their capacity to acquire insight, says that, quote, under the immediate impact of strong feelings, a young child will be quite unable to reflect, and he will often need to be controlled, which I mentioned to you earlier. This is the reason why, as she pointed out, quote, the analyst's constant endeavor to put the child's wishes and feelings into words aims at channeling actions into thoughts and verbal expression. End of quote. All the above is particularly true of children under 5 years of age, since by latency the child is more capable of exercising much better control in these various regards. A little reflection will show us some of the parallels with the adult. The adult too, under the impact of strong emotions, cannot always function efficiently, either in life or in the therapeutic situation, in the analysis. And it is for this reason that in patients undergoing emotional crisis in inverted commas, of various types, analysis may not be indicated, because under the impact of such events, therapy is frequently not possible, while that doesn't settle down. One reason for this is that the capacity for reflective or critical self-observation will be lost temporarily in this situation. Absorbed as the patient is by the crisis in inverted commas itself is absorbed by whatever the problem is, and so, the capacity for critical and rational and cool self-observation is simply not going to be there. Obviously, in such circumstances, the capacity for insight is highly compromised, at least temporarily, as long as that situation remains active. One other parallel that can be established is the one with the true tendency of many adult patients for acting out. Naturally, the sources for acting out are many and are very variable, but in many cases are related to immaturities or deficits of the adult ego that are for the child perfectly normal and the reason for his behavior. I am referring here to the imperative character of his drives and the limited controls he can exercise over them in the case of children, his low frustration tolerance, his poor capacity to accept substitutes and to use sublimations, as I mentioned to you earlier. But it is precisely all these variables that favor the tendency to act out in those adults that retain many of these characteristics. It is such adults that will have a tendency to act out rather than to be reflective. So, the tendency to act out is, as you well know, one of the greatest enemies of the capacity for insight, both in the case of children and certainly in the case of adults. Let us now consider the child's capacity for self-observation. Unquestionable, it is present in children 3, 4, and 5 years of age, though it may differ somewhat from that capacity in the adult. But children can self-observe. Not as well as adults, not with the constancy of adults, and if it is in relation to painful events, they are going to move out of there. The child can certainly tell us his feelings, but in contrast with the adult, he cannot do so in the sustained, consistent, and controlled form of the latter, when in the presence of pain, painful, psychical emotion. He does it in the form of short-lived sudden flashes and eruptions. That's a child. But the child up to the age of 4 or 5 is much more in contact with his need, feeling, wishes, and impulses than the latency child, the adolescent, and the adult. In fact, they are in the forefront of the mind. A little boy of 3 or 4 says, I'm going to marry my mommy and send daddy away. You know, it's there, no problem. Of course, all of that will be enormously well defended in a latency child and adolescent, certainly in an adult that, had such fantasies at any point in time. He is not only more in touch with these feelings, but can communicate them very readily. He tells us how much in love he is with his mother, as I said, or how he hates his father, or how he would like his younger sibling to be sent back to wherever it is that he came from, or he says he wants to kill him or her, and so on. We can understand this easiness in communication between his ego and his id is normal for that stage. If we consider that his superego is still not fully structured and functional, and consequently somewhat tolerant of these impulses, it is possible too that such behavior is due to the combination of the imperative nature of his impulses concomitant with limited superego structuralization, so there is a reinforcement from both sides. What the child of this age certainly lacks, though, is the capacity for self-observation in a reflective, critical, and sustained manner. There are children of this age incapable of insight. I do not think so personally, though it manifests itself in a different way and has imposed on its forms of expression the limitation resulting from the degree of development achieved by the ego, and as such, all those functional characteristics, such as fleeing from pain and so on, that are so well described in Mrs. Kennedy's paper at this symposium. As for the latency child and the adolescent, there is no doubt that they not only possess the capacity for self-observation, but that they can do so in a reflective and critical manner. Nevertheless, the developmental characteristics of these two stages are such that not infrequently they are forced to fight this function and the acquisition of insight. This function of self-observation, especially reflective self-observation, is one among many ego functions involved in the acquisition of insight, a fact that was well established by Chris early on. It is perhaps the only one that has been studied in some depth. For example, Dr. Hatchett from Michigan, actually, in Ann Arbor, he's a professor in the School of Psychology there and a psychoanalyst, in his paper called Insight and Self-Observation that was published in 1973, describes this very well. Some more efforts in this direction will contribute to clarify some of the existing confusion. If we consider briefly the adult situation in this regard, We know that the capacity for reflective, critical self-observation is one positive indicator for analyzability. We know and we look for this. How self-critical they can be, how well can they self-observe, how capable are they of this. We know that that is usually indicative of a favorable prognosis and a more successful therapeutic process. We know as well that when this function is damaged, either by primary reasons or by, for example, ego deficit, marginal intelligence, and so on, or by secondary reasons, that is, a type of conflicts and defenses used, treatment progress would be compromised due to the constriction that such factors impose in the acquisition of insight. And insight is essential for improvement. Another variable already mentioned is a normal child tendency to actively avoid conflictual and painful situations, and the universal tendency they demonstrate to externalize and negate such events. All analysts are well aware of many adult patients that retain these characteristics and behave both in life and in the analytical situation in a similar fashion. It seems as if such patients have a fixation to these stages, a fixation that favors the utilization of the mechanism mentioned well past the developmental stage where they are not only legitimate but normal. In such patients, sooner or later, we come across the conflicts, traumas, and events that in the genetic sense will explain this abnormal tendency that they have retained to run from pain, to avoid being self-observing and self-critical. Of course, we all know the difficulties that the excessive use of externalization as a defense can create in terms of the acquisition of insight, and it's obvious that this is normal for children, particularly children at a certain stage in life, certain developmental stages like latency. An adult that retains the tendency to externalize is in the same situation of a child in the latency period, where normally he is using externalization because that goes to the stage of development. Obviously, you are an adult that has retained this tendency because of the fixation for whatever reason, or the type of conflict that force you to do that, then you are in the same situation that the child was. What I'm trying to show you is that all the factors that clearly are the ones that interfere with the child's ability to produce insight efficiently and in a uniform manner and in a consistent manner can be seen in adults and exactly for the same reason, though they are not children anymore. So, in many ways, when you have one such patient, one of the things that you have to do is look at what are the problems, conflicts, defenses being used, fixations that somehow interfere with the capacity to produce insight. Because if you don't pay attention to that, that patient is never going to improve appropriately. Because simply he has no capacity for insight. Because his defensive structure, the nature of his conflict, the nature of his fixation points, is going to interfere severely with it. In such cases, I think you have a priority as a therapist, and that is you need to look at these areas that are creating the problem of the patient's inability to be self-reflective, self-critical, self-introspect, and things of that kind, so that you can remove them and then the patient can go on with the treatment. Mrs. Kennedy in 1978 made reference to the fact that if the conceptual skills of the child remain tied to magical thinking, the treatment process is influenced by it as well as his capacity for insight, obviously. Yeah. Well, you don't remember patients where this is the case, that they have retained magical thinking and they essentially expect you to produce magic and to magically make them better. They don't think that they have to do anything. In fact, they say, well, how come you're not helping me? It's as if you have some abracadabra kind of formula that you can use and that will change the patient's situation. She mentioned, for example, a little girl, 6-year-old, who says about her therapist, if he was really clever, he would do magic to make her feel better, which is exactly what some adult patients, if you were really clever, you make them better. How? Magically. You don't have to do anything. You just do it. We're thus reminded of the type of adult patient who expects the therapist to improve or cure them magically, angrily rejecting every effort he makes to have the patient observe himself. That is, a therapist made to have the patient to observe himself, to free associate, or to make use of interpretations or look at dreams. Angrily rejects these things. These are patients that will wait indefinitely for the therapist's magic. They seek you out. And given that you don't have magic, that's a problem. And do not wish to work or suffer. They are avoiding pain. They are behaving like a child that has to avoid pain in order to resolve their emotional difficulties. Now, once you have identified a situation, you obviously have to look very closely at what it is. What kind of pain is that he can look at that he's avoiding like the plague and is in fact bringing his treatment to a standstill, because it becomes a priority to deal with that problem if the treatment is going to move forward. The same happens in the case of the child's belief in the omnipotence of the adults. Thus, our inability to make things better quickly, to reduce the conflicts and anxiety, as well as our inability to gratify many of the needs of the patient, is erroneously interpreted, as Mrs. Kennedy remarks, by the child and by the adult patient that you can help magically. To him, to this type of patient, we simply do not want to help, with the consequent aggressive and hostile reaction on their part. Of course, this is true too of those adults who had retained such a belief and that for this reason add themselves to the number of patients that expects to be cured by magic means. And there are quite a number of those. Again, once you identify that, you have to deal with that. Otherwise, you're not going anywhere with that patient, ever. Other child patients that she mentions are incapable of talking during the session for some time because they feel extremely anxious, guilty, or ashamed. This leads to a conscious withholding of information or a deliberate distortion of the facts for a variable period of time, sometimes quite lengthy. It is my opinion that no adult analyst can avoid a deja vu experience in relation to all the above. Which one of us has not had a patient that is ashamed, can tell you, feels guilty, distorts things, beat around the bush, doesn't free associate properly, avoids telling you certain things, and so on. Again, given that these treatments are based, on the freedom to free associate and being truthful and honest and trust, and your therapist in that sense with this material. Once you identify that problem, you have to find out what it is that is leading to this shame, this guilt, this inability to tell you what it is. Because as long as that is the case, that's a big stone on the road that you have to traverse, and you can go through that stone without removing it from the road. Now let us look for a while at the role that egocentrism plays in children. We talk about the tendency of children to be egocentric. We know that this is very marked up to the age of 4 or 5. Children believe that they are the center of the world. During this time, every event is interpreted in reference to the child's ego. Such a tendency, of course, diminishes gradually after the age mentioned, but is still present to a lesser degree up to the age of 10 or 11, which may surprise a lot of people. A more or less important remnant of this is retained into adulthood, where it attaches itself to the narcissistic elements present in any given personality, whether normal or pathological. In some cases, the persisting egocentric component is significant and as such influence the type of personality, its pathology, the capacity for insight, and even the prognosis of the patient. This egocentrism is a highly distorting factor that, among other things, interferes with understanding causality, cause and effect, and with the capacity to evaluate objectively external reality. Naturally, failures in this regard are an important obstacle for the acquisition of what I have called genuine insights. I am using this term intently in order to differentiate it here from false insights. I mean now those connections made by certain patients, either spontaneously or after an interpretation by the therapist for defensive purposes. In other words, with the clear intention of avoiding genuine or significant insights. In this way, they distort the aims and context of the interpretation and manage to establish a number of false connections aimed at reconstructing, in the genetic sense, a concatenation of events by means of which they try to explain and justify the behavior, the symptoms, and or their psychopathology. Typically, these false reconstructions and the subsequent false insights are really designed to absolve the patient from all responsibility, mostly through massive externalization, where the guilt is placed on environmental factors or on the human objects in that environment, where they have nothing to do with it. The therapist is in fact surprised by the persistence of this behavior on the patient's side, as well as by his reactions when the therapist tries to point out his error, what he's actually doing and the reasons why he's doing this. It is one of rage and hostility coupled with accusations that the therapist is incompetent, stupid, or incapable of understanding the patient. Such a situation can be observed in various degrees of malignancy in patients with a variety of narcissistic problems, where the idea of the self as perfect must be maintained at any price. This is true of some borderline patients with narcissistic problems, and even of some neurotic patients with a large narcissistic component. But in this latter case, the patient's reaction is not as malignant, and he responds to the appropriate interpretation. Now, let us look now for a little bit. Let me see how much more I have. Just a few more pages. But it makes the comparison between children and adults very clear, and I think it really clarifies the problem that this poses very well. If we look at the limited capacity of children for regression at the service of the ego, which we mentioned earlier, something that we require of adults during psychoanalytic treatment. We say, lie down there, give me your free association. Of course, the patient regresses at the service of the ego, as we call it. But such regression seems contrary to the basic purposes of development during childhood, since the trend is to leave behind, bury and master wishes, needs, gratifications, and behaviors that become inappropriate as the child moves forward in his development. It is frequently said, for this reason, that at this age, in some ways, analysis runs contrary to the developmental tendencies. To this we must add that the ego controls of the child over his impulses is precarious, particularly where it has been acquired recently. The ego fears any regressive tendency, feeling uncertain of his capacity to remain in control. This state of affairs, typical of children, applies as well to some adult patients with a specific ego deficit, a situation that makes them very fearful of losing control over their impulses in general, so they are not going to get there. Still, in other cases, the ego fear is more specific and related to certain conflictual areas where ego control is maintained only at great expense. Naturally, when the analysis approaches such areas, the ego strongly opposes the regressive tendency out of its fear of losing control. Frequently, with the child and some adults, we can observe either spontaneously through the regression or as a result of inappropriate content interpretations, a breakthrough of instinctual impulses, a sudden rush or frightening fantasies with a total or near total disruption of the ego, which is very frightening and leads many patients to abandon the treatment. They become kind of quasi-phobic of the treatment. If this happens frequently, the child may run away from the session. Did they do that? In a marked state of excitation, even a panic, or in a more controlled manner by asking the therapist permission to go to the toilet or see his mommy or whatever. The adult patient may stop treatment altogether on the basis of various excuses and rationalizations, or more dramatically, as I mentioned a moment ago, in a kind of phobic state about the treatment and or the therapist. He may become phobic of you. You are a danger. In this group are, of course, including borderline patients with ego deficits in whom certain types of content interpretations produce a paradoxical negative reaction. That is, they do not reduce the nature of the conflict or the anxiety present, but have the effect of a seductive action, and as such increase anxiety at times to traumatic proportions. It is this that explains the phobic reactions produced by some patients. Of course, the above is more acutely experienced in the case of children, given their limitations in their ability to control affects and impulses once they reach a certain height, and given the demanding imperative quality of their needs. As Mrs. Kennedy says in the same paper, quote, under the immediate impact of the strong feelings, the young child will be quite unable to reflect, and he will often need to be controlled, end of quote. One important difference between children, especially the small child and adults, is that in the former, many of his need impulses and wishes are non-conflictual. The adult world may take objection to them either because of the age of the child or because of the educational demands that are considered necessary to socialize the child. Obviously, the above makes the phenomenon of the insight much more difficult. But even in this area, if you think about it, you can notice similarities with the adult. I am referring here to those patients where a given instinctual impulse or group of them are egosyntonic. Thus, the ego and superego attitudes towards them does not favor the process of insight in that regard. Certain type of perversions are typical examples of what I have in mind here. One other basic difference between children and adults concerns the area of motivation. Importance can hardly be overestimated in the therapeutic endeavors. By contrast with the adult, many children are poorly motivated. This is partly due to the fact that many of these symptoms are egosyntonic and as such may disturb other people but not the child himself. But more important still is that the child's situation is covered by a protective shield provided by the parents, society, and so on. Thus, for example, if the child's symptoms interfere with his ability to work and adjust at the school, the teachers and parents may become concerned, but there are no direct immediate consequences for him. In sharp contrast, if the symptoms of an adult lead to an interference with his capacity to work, the consequences are enormous and immediate. Given that this is the way he earns his life and the sustenance for him and his family, while children and so on, we can understand the enormous significant disruption that takes place automatically in the presence of such problems. We can understand too why there is such a marked difference in the motivation of one vis-a-vis the other. If we address ourselves now to Mrs. Kennedy's example, where the child remarked to his therapist, "You will think that I did this because of such and such a reason, but you are wrong. I did it because of this, that, or the other, etc." This type of phenomena is a common occurrence in the treatment of adults. How many times have you heard, "Oh, I'm sure you are going to think this, that, or the other, but you're wrong. This is what I think." The same is true of those interpretations that are actively refused or simply ignored and were nevertheless the subsequent analytic material shows meaningful changes, or where even symptomatic and behavioral changes may be observable, or those children where the need to comply is so prominent that they accept interpretations without any understanding, or which some adult patients do exactly the same, or those small patients that refuse to speak about specific subjects during the sessions because they would be reminded of painful events that they want to avoid, or those children during the latency period or adolescence that identify with the analyzing function of the therapist, but only in order to apply it to others, not to themselves, or the children's preference for external solutions that alter the world or the objects in it, making everything pleasant to the internal and most painful solution. Or finally, the special difficulties that the handling of the transference poses in some cases. But none of the above, none of it, fails to bring to the analyst's mind innumerable similar examples from his adult patients. All this leads me to the conclusion that the difference between children and adults in terms of the forces or resistances that oppose the phenomena of insight are at best minimal and possibly non-existent. The only difference is that the child is entitled to these reactions as a developmental right, a right to which the adult is no longer entitled. One has the definite impression that some, among the multiplicity of reasons that can interfere with the manifestation of insight in children, prolong themselves into adulthood in one area or another, and in various combinations, according to the vicissitudes of each individual's development. And this is so in spite of the fact that many of the evil deficits observable in the child related to the stage of development have been superseded in the adult. We cannot but be surprised at the great complexity of the processes that lead to the acquisition of insight, the large number of variables that are involved in it, and in consequence, the easiness with which the process can be interfered with or become inoperant. Of course, in children, many of these factors or variables are active simultaneously and may become cumulative in their effect, thus blocking the possibility of the child's production of insights similar to those of the adults in ideal conditions. In adults, it is generally one or another of these various factors that interfere with the process, but rarely all of them acting simultaneously, and may be the case in some children. The situation is further complicated because we take as the definitional model of the insight the phenomenon that becomes manifest in the adult under ideal conditions, and this adult form we apply to the child, concluding then that the child is not capable of insights. It is my opinion, though, that the child produces insight, but that its characteristics are quite different from those observable in adults. The difference consists, on the one hand, that in the child's case the experience cannot be verbalized, and certainly not with the adornments and elaborations that some gifted adults are capable of. And on the other hand, all the many factors already mentioned are strongly opposed to the contents of the insight entering consciousness, that is, becoming conscious. If that is so, why do we expect them to verbalize their insights, and why do we conclude from their inability to do so that the child, especially the latency child, is not capable of producing insights? It seems to me more logical to conclude, given that the processes that lead to insights and the consequences of it are, as we have seen, observable in children, that the child produces insights, but that they have their own characteristics and references and are naturally different from those of the adult. As Anna Foley says, quote, with children, the bulk of the resistance, or at worst, the total willingness to be analyzed, does stem from the ego's age, adequate preference for clinging to its own method for safeguarding or reinstating well-being, and for their inclination to reject all others. Analytic insight belongs to the latter category, and it taxes the therapist's technical skill and ingenuity to lead his patients towards accepting it. In short and in summary, I hope that you got the idea that this is something that you need to watch very closely in any psychotherapeutic process, that if you identify any of these factors, which are a large number of them, as you can see, and I haven't been insulted, though I gave you quite a large number of them, you may need to assess up to what point such a difficulty will torpedo the treatment. And so you may have to change your priorities in terms of what do you do next? What do you handle next? What type of conflict come to the foreground as something that has to be dealt with before you can continue to a successful end in the treatment of this particular patient. If you don't pay attention to these things, your success will be limited, and will be limited by the patient's inability to go all the way where he needs to be. So that's what I have for you for tonight. Thank you for coming here.